You are watching programming from the East-West Center in Washington, D.C.
Well, good morning from Washington, D.C. Good day, good evening, at whatever time and from wherever you're joining us today. We're delighted to have you for the East-West Center program on the courteous power, Japan and Southeast Asia in the Indo-Pacific era. And we have a distinguished group of experts today, two who are part of the book project itself, Professor John Ciorciari, and of course, Nobuhiro Aizawa, who both participants in the book project and authors. And then we have with us our colleague, Professor Watanabe as well to make additional comments. So really an all-star cast of experts on Japan's role in Southeast Asia. So welcome. I know you will enjoy the program. I can't think of a better time. The Indo-Pacific strategy came out mid-February, which highlighted, of course, the importance of the US-Japan alliance, but also of Southeast Asia and working with US allies and partners, including Japan in the region. So this timing couldn't be better. Some of you will also be knowledgeable that the United States plans to hold an in-person summit at the leaders level between the US and ASEAN in the coming weeks and months. And so that's on the agenda. And then, of course, we all know the tragic events over the last couple of weeks in Ukraine has brought further attention and interest in the role of Asian powers, including, of course, Japan and Southeast Asia, amongst others. So this convergence, both of tragedy as well as of policy directions and importance, is really important to the context for this book. And we should also take those into account. I'd also flag one other thing, the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies annual report on Southeast Asian views of the region and of the role of dialogue partners. And there are some very, very interesting findings about Japan in the latest 2022 study that the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies in Singapore, and I urge you to look at that. It talks about how much Japan is the most trusted power amongst the dialogue partners, and yet also notes that there is some fall off in Japan's role in the region and some issues that confront Japan's engagement with Southeast Asia. So let us turn to the experts who will tell us what's going on and what we can expect. And our first speaker, Professor Ciorciari, will take us through the book, and then we'll have Nobu Aizawa talk about some of the non-government ways in which Japan engages the region, private sector, culture, and civil society. And then Professor Watanabe will broaden it out to some fundamental themes and issues in Japan's foreign policy, including, I'm sure, the issue of China. With that, over to you, John. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having us, Satu, and thanks, of course, to Sarah and the team at East-West Center for setting this up. We're delighted to be able to share the findings from this collaborative project that has resulted in an edited volume from the University of Michigan Press called The Courteous Power. And here you see a visual embodiment of Japan's identity as a courteous power with former Prime Minister Abe showing the way for Aung San Suu Kyi. What I'd like to do, as Satu previewed, is to give a very brief overview of the content of the book, the main themes. And then, of course, Nobu will follow with some added insights, particularly on the roles of non-governmental actors. So to start with, we set out as a group of Japanese, Southeast Asian, and North American scholars from various disciplines to look at this crucial and enduring relationship between Japan and Southeast Asia. Here's an image of then Prime Minister Takeo Fukuda in Singapore in 1977, the same swing through Southeast Asia that produced his speech enunciating the Fukuda Doctrine, which in many ways continues to be a ballast for Japan's engagement with Southeast Asia, a respectful, a partner that listens and that tends to guide rather than to try to use a heavy hand in its relations with the region. In the book, we have several themes that we address. One is that we think In an era when everyone's looking at Southeast Asia through the prism of Sino-US competition, Japan's role is often underappreciated. And in fact, Japan has had a very active and often more autonomous role in Southeast Asia than it's given credit for. A second theme we address in the book is this question of continuity and change. I started with an image of Prime Minister Fukuda, and certainly there are strong elements of continuity, but the title page here of the book has, of course, a picture of Prime Minister Abe, who shook things up a bit, and there has been some element of change. That's why we focus on the Indo-Pacific era, to look at what's new and what isn't in this latest chapter of Japan's engagement with the region. As we've already previewed, a good portion of the book is about the roles of non-state actors, which tend to get short shrift in scholarly treatments of the international exchange between Japan and Southeast Asia. And what emerged from this series of studies from the various expert contributors was our view of Japan's identity as a courteous power, a country that has cultivated an image of being attentive, being respectful to its Southeast Asian partners and responsive to their needs. As I'll discuss later, this isn't entirely a good thing. There are drawbacks to its role as a courteous power, but there seems to be relatively strong agreement among our contributors and others whom we've engaged with through the project that Japan, in fact, has this identity. And Satu just mentioned that it's not only at the very highest levels. This is an attitude broadly held by Southeast Asians as reflected in these annual ISIS surveys. So we start off by in the introduction, by framing Japan as an active and often quite autonomous actor in Southeast Asia and focusing on multiple channels of influence. Some of these, of course, occur through official relations, like this image here of Japanese and Philippine Coast Guard forces cooperating, through security, economic ties, and diplomatic linkages. And the latter half of the book is all about non-state actors and their importance. As Nobu will describe in more detail, we examine the roles of businesses, of NGOs, even of individual Japanese people. In the case of one of our chapters, a focus on migrant Japanese women. And last but not least, captured in the image on the bottom right, is the idea of cultural production and consumption in Japanese soft power through mechanisms like manga and anime. So the first part of the book, as I mentioned, is about official relations between Japan and Southeast Asia, whether here in the COVID era via video or in more normal times through Japan's very robust in-person engagement and presence diplomatically and otherwise in the region. We've got a series of 5 chapters that cover this theme, and I'll just point out briefly the headlines from each. I wrote the first, and it's about Japan as a key to Southeast Asian diversification in an era in which Southeast Asia faces a new round, the latest round of its efforts to steer among great power competition and to manage asymmetric relations with larger external powers. Japan has been and continues to be a key to their ability to diversify. For Southeast Asian countries, being caught between an American hammer and a Chinese anvil is not a desirable strategic place to be. It's much more preferable to have a number of different partners with whom to engage. And that includes areas such as aid, trade, and investment. It includes governance, so that if Western governments, for example, are sanctioning a particular government and China is not seen as an ideal partner, Japan can provide a third option, a country that's been willing to deal with governments in a different way than Western aid donors, but also distinct from the Chinese approach. Trade and investment, Japan has long been a major player in Southeast Asia. In fact, for some countries like Thailand, Japan is less a diversifier than sort of the primary investment. But in most Southeast Asian countries, even though China is now the primary trade partner, Japan remains a major player. And certainly in terms of foreign direct investment, Japan in many countries is still the leading holder of stock of FDI. And so is an essential player in diversifying those relationships. Japan also has an important role in multilateral diplomacy, again, often cultivating a position that is somewhat distinct from, say, the US-led or Western approach, broadly speaking, and and the approach from Beijing. And this has taken the form of a number of initiatives from the early 90s to with the Nakayama proposal to the late 1990s with the bid for an Asian monetary fund, in which Japan has carved out an identity as a major supporter of multilateral diplomacy in and around Southeast Asia, a way for those countries, again, to further diversify. And increasingly, last but not least, Japan has had a more significant security role with regard to Coast Guard assistance, capacity building, especially in Vietnam and the Philippines. And so coming onto the scene as an actor that can help diversify security ties, a particular concern of Southeast Asian countries that have been worried about American stability as a security provider, consistency as a security provider in the region. That gets us on to the next chapter by Ken Jimbo, pictured on the upper right, who looks at security assistance in Japan's approach. And again, we see this image of Japan as a courteous power, a country that has tried to edge its way onto the scene by engaging in security networks in Southeast Asia, by building capacity and being active in defense diplomacy, substantial but not provocative. Not a country that is trying to break full speed out of its Article 9 constitutional constraints, but instead one trying to normalize its role in Southeast Asia through less contentious or controversial means of cooperation and incrementally develop its position as a security provider in the region. Keikoga, pictured on the bottom, then turns to Japan's diplomatic engagement with ASEAN and the broader region. And in particular, he focuses on the availability of wedge strategies. He looks, for example, at the process of the formation of the East Asia Summit and how Japan was able to contribute to a wedge within ASEAN that made it more difficult for China to develop the EAS as sort of a Sino-centric organization. At the same time, Kay recognizes and emphasizes that other powers can play wedge strategies against Japan. And this is a factor that limits Japan's ability to mobilize cooperation with ASEAN, both within and outside of Southeast Asia. This is largely by design. Japan has been comfortable with a regional order in and around Southeast Asia that makes it difficult for any large power, including itself, to bend ASEAN easily to its will. And so ASEAN's consensus-seeking model of diplomacy enables its small to mid-sized members to play diplomatic defense that constrains Japan, but it also constrains China and others that Japan may be concerned about. And by and large, Japanese elites have been comfortable with that arrangement. Sean Narayan then turns in the next chapter to a discussion of unity and centrality in ASEAN foreign affairs and how that relates to Japanese objectives in the region. He notes that ASEAN's inability to coalesce around certain key issues like the South China Sea has given Japan increasing incentives to want to engage in minilateral cooperation on a sort of ASEAN minus X basis. However, and the initial rollout of the FOIP in 2016, when Abe had introduced the Indo-Pacific idea in a speech in Nairobi, suggested to many observers that Japan might be trying to reorganize its focus in Southeast Asia from an ASEAN-centered model to one centered more on the Quad. Nevertheless, Narayan notes that as Japan rolled out the FOIP concept, cool or mixed reactions from Southeast Asian capitals quickly led Japan to backtrack and to fall back on a more traditional approach to the region that does in fact prioritize ASEAN unity and centrality. This is a dilemma for Japan because ASEAN is gridlocked on many important issues. Even the response to Ukraine has seen important disunity within ASEAN. And so we can expect this to be something that Japan revisits. But for the moment, we see more continuity than change as the FOIP idea has settled into the Indo-Pacific landscape. Calvin Fung, pictured on the bottom right, discusses Japan's particular style of leadership in Southeast Asia, kind of leadership from behind, and again, consistent with the idea of a courteous approach. He looks at the power of that approach, which is to be able to mobilize countries identify shared interests and have kind of an aggregating effect. But he also notes the important limits, and he shows how in the early 1990s with the Nakayama proposal, with the creation of the East Asia Summit, and again with the introduction of the FOIP concept, in none of those three cases was Japan able to simply dictate to Southeast Asian countries what its preferences were and have them follow. In each case, there were important compromises, and ultimately the initiatives came about more because of Southeast Asian leadership than because Japan was steering with a heavy hand. Again, this is part of the courteous approach, and it shows us sort of what's beneficial about it. Japan got most of what it wanted at a reasonable political cost, but also the limitations. Japan has not proven able, nor have other external powers, to easily shape ASEAN preferences on issues for which they disagree. So that's the first half of the book. And the second, as I said, deals with the roles of non-state actors. I will just touch glancingly on these because Nobu will fill these in. But whether you're looking at the Toyota Corporation here in Bangkok or other examples, our authors look at a number of different actors who have played important roles. Kitty Brasirtuk looks at the Japanese business role over time, from the era of Japan Inc. to the current environment in which there's a greater sort of convergence between business and strategic elements of Japanese foreign policy. Nobu, as he will discuss, looks at the role of democracy in Japan's engagement with Southeast Asia, in particular with reference to the aftermath of the 2014 Thai coup. And Siriporn Wajwalku examines Japanese NGOs in the Mekong region, showing the tension that exists between those NGOs that are closer to the government but may lack sort of grassroots credibility and connections versus others that have the grassroots connections but have a little less ability to shape relations between the Japanese and host governments. Our last two chapters look at people-to-people diplomacy with Leng Leng Tang and Mika Toyota, examining the various roles the Japanese women have had in Southeast Asia through family networks, through volunteer work as local entrepreneurs, and how that has provided some of the fabric that ties the two groups of societies together and contributes to Japan's positive image in the region and identity as a courteous power. And last but not least, Carl Changchua examines Japanese soft power through the cultural lens. A good example of this phenomenon is a Japanese decision not to go after prosecuting Vietnamese producers that knocked off Japanese intellectual property for Doraemon tofu. And those knockoff products actually became so popular that it stimulated more interest in copyrighted and trademarked Japanese products. And so here you had an example of a sort of soft power approach that was courteous in the sense that Japan wasn't using a heavy hand and ended up benefiting from it. So a few takeaways that we have from the book before I hand over to Nobu. One is the question of, well, why be a courteous power as we see Kishida exhibiting courtesy to a Japanese audience in Tokyo? Well, one, it's a necessity. Japan's wartime legacy, the Article 9 constraints on military power, meant that Japan wouldn't have the same tools to be able to exercise a more heavy-handed approach to Southeast Asia. And those constraints are one important reason why Japan arrived at this arrangement. It's important to say that Japan's relations are not courteous everywhere. I think when you look at Japan-Korea relations, they're certainly not always courteous. Japan-China relations. So Southeast Asia is a particular context in which this approach has emerged and in many ways has been quite successful. Some of the benefits include the stability that Japan has provided, the trust evident in those surveys that Satu mentioned that Japan has earned, and the ability to get most of what Japan wants through this approach that President Obama once called leading from behind. Of course, that approach was criticized by many in the United States, but in Japan, this approach has gotten quite a bit of currency as a way to mobilize a diverse set of actors toward shared interests. I mentioned earlier that there are some drawbacks too. Many critics of Japan's contemporary approach say it's just not tough enough, especially in the face of rising Chinese assertiveness and power in the region. And indeed, As Calvin Fung's chapter shows, there are some limits to the exercise of courteous power. Another common critique is that Japan's courteous approach often involves deference and politeness to sovereign powers, some of whom abuse their domestic authorities. And so if one looks at Myanmar or Cambodia, Japan is often faulted for being too easy on governments that are illiberal or that are repressive. And those drawbacks have to be taken in balance with some of the benefits. The general, I think, conclusion of our study is that Japan's approach, given its constraints, has been pretty successful, but it is important to note these important limitations. The last thing is to say briefly about the path ahead. Our study suggests that although the Kishida administration has used pretty strong rhetoric vis-a-vis China and with regard to the idea of a free and open Indo-Pacific, trend lines to us suggest more continuity than change. And that's generally appreciated by Southeast Asian countries who see Japan as this key diversifier and who value Japan's relative stability when other great powers' policies toward the region have swung more precipitously. The last thing I'll say in handing off to Nobu is our study also suggests it won't just be officials in Tokyo or in embassies who are responsible for the stability and the nature of the relations going forward. Non-state actors will also play a crucial role. And that's where I'll hand off to my friend and colleague to walk us through some of those dynamics.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, John, for handing over. And also, thank you very much, Satu-san and all the East-West Center colleagues for this wonderful event. I just want to add some color. I think John has touched upon all the points, especially on Japan's role, especially from the non-government actors. Of course, in the world of international relations, the government-to-government relations will be at the center. But when we particularly look at Japan and Southeast Asia, I definitely have to emphasize the role of the non-government because simply they have been the pillar of the relationship, what it is right now. First of all, I just wanted to share with you an episode because John has well coined the term courteous power, and when he did that, I recall that when I was in Indonesia, a presidential office staff told me, isn't Japan an Islamic country? He was saying that as a compliment. And I asked him, well, what do you mean by that? And well, in Islam, in Bahasa Indonesia, they call it sopan. So that's respectful. Islamic culture, we take this respect. A relationship with respect is a serious value in our religion, and I see Japan shares that. That's why our relationship with Japan is very special, and we expect a different relationship. When they say different, especially different from the United States, So and to say that word, they use the word Islam. And when John beautifully coined the word courteous power. It kind of linked to that episode that I had in my mind for a long time. So, it's in that sense, I think the concept is a very powerful and a useful one. The thing that I want to share is a little bit of color, especially, yes, Japan is a courteous power because of the necessity and all the limits in our toolkit, especially in the government toolkit. But also there's one factor I want to highlight is that there are a huge population of Japanese living in Southeast Asia. I think that is one reason why Japan is courteous. When you ask the question, like, how did we get here? How did we get to the point that Japan identify as a courteous power? I cannot think without highlighting the role of a Japanese living in Southeast Asia. They already, I would say, are a major political constituency, not just an economic and social constituency, but a political constituency that shapes the Japanese foreign policy to Southeast Asia. The population in Southeast Asia is almost 210,000 people. that is still half of Japanese living in United States. United States around 400,000. But it's obviously more than Japanese living in China. It's around 100,000. It's double of the size that Japanese living in China. And if you look at just cities, Bangkok is like the second most populous, city in the world by Japanese. First is Los Angeles, second is Bangkok, third is New York. So there's Bangkok in between the two major Japanese living. So I think that really shapes the whole relationship. And that in my chapter, that is exactly why I focus on the role of Japanese business people in Thailand, especially in Bangkok, because their political voice was not only for a business and prosperity, but also the Bangkok Japanese society very much influenced the Kante or the prime minister not to follow the rhetoric exactly as the United States or Washington, D.C. said. In that time, it was to bash the 2014 coup. But also at the same time, the Japanese community in Bangkok say, to the country that don't follow the same rhetoric. But at the same time, they were telling the Bangkok partners, which at that time was Prayut and the military leaders and also the business peoples, that Japan definitely need democracy. So, but with the different rationale, which is we're not saying that we're discrediting the political legitimacy, but we're saying because that's very important for the Thai economy, for its predictability and accountability. So it's not necessarily, sanctioning, but it was a courteous suggestion to say that gave face to both the military junta and the Japanese prime minister's office. I think that idea wouldn't come without the voice of the Japanese business, who knew too well about what is important to maintain the relationship vis-a-vis Thailand and also vis-a-vis United States as well. So they very much worked as a political ballast. John has rightly said, Japan's role as a ballast, but the business people meant function in a critical moment. Interestingly, especially in Thailand, there was another channel, which is about the cultural one. As John already has introduced, the manga or the animation part has made a major kind of cultural connections and networks and kind of proximity between the civil society. But what kind of society they made the proximity is very interesting. It is very much on the youth. And that really showed in the Thai protest as well. The cultural part not only connected the government to government or the business to business, but also the anti-government movement as well. In Thailand, if you look at the 2020 and 21, anti-government, there's this famous parody song of Tottoko Hamutaro. The Hamutaro is a mouse character who has a song about a lot of eating their foods, but they made the words by eating the people's tax, which is to criticize the monarchy. And in doing so, they use the Japanese animation as an icon of it. There's another animation of Attack of Titans. That's also another animation of a protest song. So it's not just the Hunger Games, depicted by the movies, but also these Japanese animation has become an avenue of a somewhat a liberal value sharing method. This is, of course, it was not the G2G, as in our chapter says, it's not a government-led initiative. It is much more of a cultural and civil society led. But this gave a channel which could be a very inconvenient channel for a G2G relationship. But nevertheless, the Japanese society and the Southeast Asian society really appreciates this proximity. And when the media shows in Japan this had a function that the Japanese society will not just dismiss Thailand as a military junta ruled government, but because of, if you see the scenes of Thai young protesters using Japanese animation icons, that really gives the Japanese youngsters a cultural and an emotional affinity to the Thai people. So we don't have to paint Thailand as just a junta ruled country. The society will see with these cultural icons. And also with the other part of civil society, when women in tourism also definitely played a great role. And in recent years, especially the tourism for women and also the elderly as well, they paved the way, especially when Japan was changing immigration law as well. As John said, Japanese, courtesy was not, in one way was a necessity, but not always to every part of the world, as Korea and China, it has a different attitude. But especially because of tourism from Southeast Asia to Japan and Japan to Southeast Asia, really paved the way of a political change in everywhere, especially on their issuance of visas. For example, tourism visas in Japan with very minimum political objection, and also during the COVID time too, when they wanted to open up a fast track channel with Vietnam and Malaysia and Thailand, the public opposition was minuscule. And I wouldn't discount this history and the context of all these women in tourism connecting the civil society has played a very significant role in making those political choices for the government. So just to paint another color in what John has already beautifully laid out, this business and cultural and civil society relation between Japan and Southeast Asia has become the platform of the kind of favorability, but also sharing fundamental values between the two regions. Thank you very much.
Terrific. Over to you, Professor Watanabe. Thank you so much, Nobu.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this very interesting webinar by East-West Center in Washington. And it's a privilege for me to be a part of it with such fantastic distinguished speakers today. And having said that, please allow me to be a little bit provocative, and then in order to stimulate or activate discussion. And I totally agree with Dr. Ciorciari's analysis and also the use of terms. Japan has been a courteous power in Southeast Asia. And I really appreciate the way you picked up extremely nice term, courteous, somewhat mentioned by Professor Aizawa. One could argue that Japan's posture towards Southeast Asia could be innocuous or harmful or naive, but you nicely picked up the term that courteous. But I would like to raise two simple questions. And the first one is, I totally agree with your point. At the same time, my first question is it enough for Japan to engage in Southeast Asia as a courteous power, given that we have seen an enormous influence coming from China? So for the past 5 decades, Japan's strategy of courteous power has functioned well. And I totally agree with your observation. But maybe we are in a kind of a critical juncture at this moment. Then we have to seriously think about whether this strategy will be enough in the future, both in terms of Japan, as well also from perspectives of Southeast Asian or ASEAN countries. Because ASEAN is such a diverse, mixture of countries and also religions and also ethnicities, whatever. In that sense, maybe ASEAN might be helpful to have a very more assertive Japan in a different, note from China. That's my first question. And the second point, I really like that the book and authors emphasize the role of non-state actors. And I totally agree with the point. That could be one big difference between Chinese approach to Southeast Asia and also Japan's approach to Southeast Asia. At the same time, a couple of elements that Dr. Aizawa mentioned remind me of Korea, South Korea. Like actually non-state actors, like a people-to-people exchange, or like I would say soft power, like a Korean soap opera, the Korean dramas, whatever. Those somewhat overlap. Japan's like strengths in non-state actors and also Korean strengths in non-state actors. At the same time, after the Moon Jae-in came into power, the Korean government initiated a new southern policy in December 2017. And then gradually, particularly at this moment, we have seen the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And now even Japan, but also Korea are very sensitive about like strengthening supply chain resilience. And of course, Southeast Asia is the most attractive point. So I can see from now on, we might have a kind of a semi-competition over Southeast Asia with a new actor, actually very important and traditional actor, but in a new way, South Korea might come in. If we have not 3, but 4 big players in Southeast Asia, is Japan being a Courteous player? Is it enough, or what kind of changes Japan should expect, or what Japan should do? How Japan's policy towards South Asia should be modified? That's the second question. And I just want to give one comment, and I will finish. As Dr. Rimaya mentioned, actually, I'm also a big fan of ICS annual survey, the state of Southeast Asia. And then I wanted to highlight a little bit different angle. That is, I noticed now we cannot underestimate the growing popularity of China among Southeast Asian countries, particularly after the COVID pandemic. I noticed that the most favorable country vis-a-vis reaction or like assistance of COVID fighting against COVID-19 was China. And the second country was like Japan. Let's say 44% of respondents answered China was the most effective player vis-a-vis fighting against COVID-19 among Southeastern countries respondents. Japan ranked second, but only 18%, and the EU 10%, and the US almost like 10%. So you can see a difference. At the same time, ASEAN countries, particularly those like respondents, appreciate the growing role of Chinese growing role in terms of economy. But at the same time, they are a little bit worried about China's growing role, particularly in terms of diplomacy and politics, and of course, a strategy. So it's kind of interesting to see some kind of a mixed reaction of Southeast Asian people vis-a-vis China. But I have to say that we should somewhat admit the fact China is gaining popularity, although China has created many problems. But so in this sense, like how should we, include this gaining popularity of China when we think about Japan's strategy towards Southeast Asia? That's a kind of question. Thank you very much.
Well, what a wonderful set of prepared remarks. And Professor Watanabe, thank you. Want to really thank you sincerely for those really terrific remarks. Many things were unmentioned. It wasn't the subject of your book. I mean, I kept thinking about Japan's relations with Taiwan, with Australia, for that matter, to some extent with India, with the EU, and how it. So I hesitate to say this, John, because you and Nobu and Chino have so many projects as distinguished professors, but may I ask you to consider in the future, perhaps looking at Japan's relations with other powers and how they refract not only bilaterally, but in Southeast Asia, because I particularly would love to see how that works. And I kept running through the questions on the US. Well, our participants who are online, many of them, I encourage you now to please submit your questions and comments. And in the meanwhile, I'll filibuster a little bit since I'm in Washington, and so far it's still allowed. So let me raise a couple of thoughts for you as we wait for some Q&A questions. One question that kept coming up to me, other than the general sort of question, is what does this mean for the US-Japan alliance? Where is the US-Japan alliance consistent with this courteousness in Southeast Asia, and where is it not? And Shino's question at the end about China factor looms large, inevitably. Is courteousness enough, given what we want to do and achieve in Southeast Asia? Will Japan come under pressure, as it were? I don't mean, sort of direct pressure, but will Japan be asked to do more in Southeast Asia? Another question that kind of came up to me is Japan now has, what I always, I'm surprised gets less play is how important Japan is to global order. And I mean rules and norms of commerce, trade, WTO, et cetera. And I wonder if the path Japan is pursuing, I was struck by John's point about intellectual property, because Japan is one of the key holders of intellectual property protections, and relaxing them in one finite, discrete case may not be much. But here's Japan, a critical player in global standards. How would this affect this global role? And particularly, is Japan now choosing more narrower tools in a toolbox, such as the Quad or the technology element of AUKUS, not necessarily, obviously, the nuclear propulsed submarines, but the technology elements that will come out of AUKUS, or the CPTPP, which does not include all of Southeast Asia and very unlikely never will include all of Southeast Asia. So those are some questions I bring to the fore, just as a way of inspiring other comments. And I finally see that we have one. So maybe if you could each take just a minute or two to any thoughts you have on each other's comments and on a couple things I raised, and then we can go to the first Q&A, which has just arrived. Okay.
Sure, I'm happy to go first, and thank you, Satu and Dr. Watanabe. I'll take the question about, is it enough for Japan to continue to be courteous, or are we at a new juncture? And that's connected closely to the question of how this relates to the US-Japan alliance. I think we need to break it down into the different dimensions of influence that Japan has in Southeast Asia. There are certain domains that are very important in which Japan can continue to operate more or less as it has, precisely because it operates within the context of the US-Japan alliance. Japan is a pivotal player in this strategic game for infrastructure finance, for example. And Japan's Quality Infrastructure Investment Initiative, widely seen as a kind of counter to the Belt and Road Initiative, is an area in which Japan need not be uncourteous in order to be a major player, to give Southeast Asian countries multiple options. Other forms of trade and investment are also consistent with this approach. So any extension of the CPTPP, for example, would be entirely consistent with Japan's longstanding MO in Southeast Asia. There are other areas where it's going to be tougher, and it very much depend on how the United States policy in the region evolves. Japan has been able to be courteous not only because of its own constraints, but because it's been able to lean on the Seventh Fleet to provide most of the muscle in terms of upholding the type of norms and standards of freedom of navigation that Satu mentioned. If the United States becomes immersed in the events unfolding on Russia's periphery and in Ukraine, and if for other reasons the US turns inward to deal with its debt and social problems and so forth, Japan may find that its existing approach is really inadequate to meet its own security objectives. Southeast Asian partners might agree with that. Japan's preference would be to address this sort of juncture and elongate the juncture by having the changes be incremental. Southeast Asian governments would welcome that too. They'd rather have it not be a sharp inflection point in which Japan does what Germany's just done and double defense spending and start shipping weapons to Ukraine. They don't want to see a 180. They want to see, everyone involved would like to see this be very, very gradual so that there isn't a kind of a crisis tipping point. That said, it depends on the US staying involved in a major way to allow that to happen. And so I think that's a critical point for the relationship. One other comment I'll say is that Japan also does face questions of a similar nature, possible trade-offs in choosing what diplomatic structures to support, whether it's Quad-based or ASEAN-based, and also how to address governance failings in places like Myanmar. Again, it's been possible for Japan to play its role in part because the Western countries have been engaged in leading the sanctions and so forth. There's a bit of a good cop, bad cop routine that the allies have with respect to countries like Myanmar. I think that's probably possible to continue for some time to come, but it's conceivable that if conditions worsen in a place like Myanmar, that Japan would face more of a decision, that it kind of has to choose sides. And so again, Japan would like to do this gradually, but it depends on how other actors operate, whether it'll have that luxury.
Thanks, John. Very interesting points. Particularly, I was taken with your point about incrementalism and not doing, if you will, a Berlin in Southeast Asia, which, on the other hand, could raise expectations or even demands of Japan in the region. So I do want to give Watanabe Sensei and Aizawa Sensei a brief moment, and then let me turn to the questions. Unless do you have something at this juncture, Shino?
Thank you very much. I'll be brief. I definitely agree with Dr. Rimaya's observation that we have to think beyond Japan's relations with Southeast Asia and Japan's relation with Taiwan and also Australia, EU. And I personally think Japan's relation with Canada is also somewhat neglected, but it's very important. But one kind of a key issue to connect all those countries would be Japan's maybe effort to strengthen supply chain resilience, cross-border supply chain resilience, including Southeast Asia and beyond. So that's a kind of interesting topic, maybe. Wait, I'll just stop here.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a really important point. And there may be more on that as we really look towards working with key allies such as Japan and others on sometimes what is called economic statecraft, sort of the high-end technology, regional resilience on key issues. So we'll look. Nobu, any comments here? And then I'll turn to the questions.
Yes, I would like to touch upon the Korea question as posed by Dr. Watanabe. Your observation is perfectly right. There is a rivalry, but also there is a compatibilities too. There's a little bit of a difference in which part of the generation of Southeast Asia that the Japanese, the soft power, and the Korean soft power is influential to. To make it very simple, there's two axes here. One is, of course, by country, and one is by generation. By generation, if you look at like 50s and 40s, maybe to the 30s, the Japanese soft power is pretty strong, who were brought up in the Japanese, especially the cultural influence when they were in the teenagers and so forth. But if you look at the 20s and 10s, these are more influenced by the Koreans. So if you just look at the cosmetics and the idea of beauty, has been changed from the Japanese icon too. But the other value is very important in soft power, which is health, to be healthy. This is of course, you have all these economic theories about coming to the middle class economic theories about changing values from beauty to healthy, and that's where Japanese are gaining another soft power, and which the wing of that is Japanese food, the food culture attached with the agriculture, and also all the consumption, supply chain network, and technology. So yes, Watanabe Sensei, you're perfectly right. Japan has to change. We can't just sit on its past success. And what we are seeing is this concept of new, health soft power, which is becoming the target of a competitive soft power in Southeast Asia from Japan's side. Food especially, and not just that, all the kind of lifestyle And this really matches with the kind of the changing style of families, the nucleus family and the urbanization, you name it. You have all these changing lifestyles in Southeast Asia. And what kind of lifestyles that they should model to? Is it the American type? You want the big car and the big house? No, it's the very small unit Japanese, but effective with a healthier concept. So I think these are the kind of new wave. So yes, the Korean culture are taking over the once competitive part of the Japanese soft power, but also Japan is recreating a new wave of its soft power in the region too.
Thank you, Nobu. Excellent and interesting point about the transition as countries develop in Southeast Asia from not just beauty, but beauty and health, which is kind of, if you will, moving up the value-added chain, value chain of people's aspirations for a fully lived life. So thank you for that. Let me turn to the questions now. We have very interesting ones. John addressed a little bit Dr. Ellen Frost, our senior fellow at the East-West Center's question about BRI. So unless you have more to say about that, her question really was about how's that playing in the region, more emphasis on anti-corruption, sustainability, et cetera, if you want to say more on that. But I was particularly intrigued by her second question, which is quite pointed about, can you see a constructive diplomatic role for Japan on the question of Chinese and Taiwanese applications for CPTP membership? And what form might such a role take? As everyone almost on this call surely knows, Japan's lead role in keeping something of akin to the TPP alive through CPTPP. And now with all these other potential docking countries, UK, Taiwan, maybe Korea soon. What do you think of that question? Anyone want to take a stab at what role you think Japan could play and manage?
I'll be happy to comment very briefly on the BRI question. Sometimes in the media, one hears about, well, China just has too much money and nobody else can be a rival to the scale of the BRI. I think that a more appropriate way to look at Japan's role is that Japan needs to be large enough, because the United States will not be in financial terms, but Japan may be large enough to provide another viable option. Does not mean it has to be comparable in volume to China, but needs to provide an alternative model that's sufficiently viable and appealing that Southeast Asian governments have multiple bidders on projects. And have confidence to be able to assert better terms for themselves and for their people than if they only had one option. And I think that Japan is eminently well positioned to play that role. It's a shame that the US government didn't get more forcefully behind the Japanese-led initiative a few years ago and instead wanted to come out with its own infrastructure plan and sort of market that. I think Japan has got to be the leader here, and that in the division of responsibilities between the allies, this is a place where Japan can and should shine in the relationship. To your earlier point, Satu, about other partners, not just the US, India, Australia, European Union. So this should be a case in which Japan can be a leader, but also setting a model that others dock into. And I think the same is true for the TPP. I wish I had an answer. I would win some sort of diplomatic award if I knew how Japan was going to deal with the twin applications of China and Taiwan. I do think that it's probably in Japan's interest, both for that reason and for others, to have a quite open approach to encourage South Korea, to encourage the Brits or others who are interested in this arrangement to take the steps to try to join it. I think that in a sense, diffusion is helpful in navigating the situation posed by the simultaneous Chinese and Taiwanese applications. Beyond that, I don't have a great response to Ellen's very important question of how best to navigate that specific question of whether to move simultaneously on the two applications, whether to kick it down the road or otherwise.
Anyone else on BRI or the CPTPP question? Yes, please, Nobu.
Yes, I think that as always, Ellen's question is such an important one. So for the BRI, I think it is now working in a reverse meaning it's not Japan contributing Southeast Asia, but Southeast Asia is contributing changing Japan's policy, so to say. So there's three phases here. For example, first, the model is not working anymore because of the rivalry with China. Second, what Japan has changed is like, maybe we can't compete dollar to dollar. So what we do is, for example, JICA will fund, with the Southeast Asian government to write the TOR, all the project designs. But when they tender it, of course, Japanese company doesn't have the money to go, to compete with the lower price. So eventually the Chinese company will take it. But at least if you have the designing power of the infrastructure, then you will kind of make it a non-exclusive project, right? So infrastructure is by design, it's a public one, which could benefit not only for the Chinese companies, but also the Japanese company and elsewhere. So that was the second phase. But of course, if you look at how the Chinese counterpart negotiates, the first TOR will be scrapped in a moment that they contracted. So that also told the Japanese it's not enough, as Watanabe Sensei has said. So Southeast Asia has become a place where Japanese policymakers think it's not enough. Right? So that's why Japanese pushing, as John said, Japan is now getting the political consensus that you have to contribute more. This is not just about the infrastructure project, but also in security realms as well. Japan has to step up. These kind of political consensus very much came from what has happened in Southeast Asia, which once the Japanese, not just the public, but the policymaker thought we had the advantage, but no longer is that the case. So I think it's that kind of a political pressure that brings the Japanese policy change. So, we're yet to see the next phase, but I think at this moment, these, infrastructure, competition, and the losing streaks of Japanese, projects is changing. And it shows how Prime Minister is visiting Southeast Asia for their in-person travels. Prime Minister Abe went to Vietnam, Thailand, Indonesia for their first visit. Prime Minister Suga went to Vietnam and Indonesia. Prime Minister Kishida went to Glasgow, but his first welcoming, head of the state was from Vietnam. So at least they slightly managed their tradition. So it does signal how Southeast Asia affects the Japanese policy in that regard.
Well, thank you. I am conscious that we're at 11:30, which was the advertised time, 11:30 Washington time, which is 60 minutes for the program. But there are a couple of questions I'd like to take up. So please forgive me. And I know some of you will have to drop off, but I hope you can continue because I think they're very interesting questions. And Amber Demery asked a question. You've talked a lot, very interestingly, Nobu, about diaspora, the diaspora influence on Japanese policy, not just social and cultural, but she kind of asks about some reports about underpaid workers. These don't match the complaints against China enterprises in the region or Chinese workers, but certainly underpayment by Japan of workers in the region. Sometimes the view that Japan's soft power and residents in Southeast Asia don't really mix with the local population. They tend to be, separate from the local population. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that and what impact that has, because, we think of Chinese diasporas, inevitably Americans living abroad, Indians living in the region. What about Japan? How is that pattern of migration, residency, immigration, intermarriage, et cetera, contributing to this mix between Japan and Southeast Asia?
Yes, unfortunately, that is a major problem right now. But I think the report is pretty much well published in Japan. So there is a public attention to these cases, and these cases has been a frequent parliamentary discussion topic. So, this is it is an unfortunate thing that the Japanese society is still abusing these workers, and the legal protection for these workers are I mean, it's not completely non-existent, but it's not functioning as it should be. But I think the attention is there, the political attention is there, the debate is there. So I think it is within the time that these will have to be changed. And the reason is not just about the moral reasons, but also it's the necessity. Japan and Southeast Asia relationship is no longer, in a way, Japan is on the higher economic status, helping Southeast Asia. But we all know that the growth in Southeast Asia could outdo the Japanese economic size and also even per capita size too, which means that Japan needs Southeast Asia to help us survive. And that political attention, especially when Prime Minister Kishida was the policy chief in the LDP party, he was one of the person who headed these migration reform. And one of the key reasons was that Japan cannot survive on its own. Right? We all have to talk about automation and foreign workers, but it's not just these low-paid workers. We need workers in every stretch of our society. And I think that political initiative is there. We are in the stage of we have to make consensus to make that happen. But there is a strategic need for, Japan cannot afford to have a Southeast Asian society turn its back on us. So, it is a necessity for changing that.
Yeah, that's a very interesting convergence there of social change born by necessity, but requiring consensus to act with Southeast Asia. So I appreciate that. Shino Watanabe raised a question, as you folks will recall, about sort of, is it enough? And sort of the China. And the last two questions I want to take are kind of both are along that theme. And I'd like to sort of close the program with each of you in this brilliant presentation and quite brilliant book, talk about this, because this is a contemporary issue. A colleague, Juhi Jung, and another colleague here, please forgive my pronunciations, Zulmi Hazim Abdul Malik, have raised a question similar to this. Courteousness is fine, but in line with how do you expect a Japanese role to evolve when US-China relations become more deteriorated? And kind of along the questions I raised with things like the Japan-Australia Defense Pact and Quad and AUKUS and other elements, and given the growing competition for influence in Southeast Asia, how long can this policy that you described so wonderfully as pursuing, how long can it last? How long is it sustainable is essentially the question from both of these two different colleagues joining us today. Can we close by maybe going in reverse order with Professor Watanabe, who raised the question, and maybe have a first cut on this because you've clearly thought about it, and then go to Nobu Aizawa and then close with Professor Ciorciari, please.
Thank you very much for all wonderful questions. And I just talk about Japan's role in US-China rivalry. Maybe I'll make some comments. And at this moment, maybe we could see that US attitude and also US general view on China slightly bit too extreme, maybe like far ahead from how Japan perceives. And then maybe like sometimes like Japan can play a role of counterweight when like a US view on China becomes not to become too extreme. At the same time, geography matters. China is far away from US, but China is just a neighbor, that we cannot somewhat avoid and we have to get along with. So in that sense, like Japan's policy toward China cannot be that antagonistic or a little bit different. So in that sense, like at least like Japan's really depend on China economically, like Japan's supply chain, Japan's trade, and so forth, should at least maintain a good relationship economics. And then China also needs Japan's market as well. And China needs to have a trade with Japan. China cannot cut Japan's trade tie. In that sense, Japan could somewhat use it as a leverage But how to strike a balance between the US and also China is a really, really difficult challenge. One last comment is this year is a 2022. So this is like a 50th year anniversary of Japan's relations with China. So that could be one momentum. But at this moment, it's hard to tell what comes next. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Watanabe. Very, very interesting indeed. Nobu, over to you.
Yes, one way to think about this is how we understand U.S.-China rivalry, and of course, the most simplest part of the rivalry is technological rivalry. In that sense, Japan and Southeast Asia is in the same boat. U.S. and China are the leading technological advanced countries, and with the capital power and also the amount of data access that they have, Japan and Southeast Asia is definitely on the second tier or the third tier, which brings a strategic commonality. How to make sure Japan and Southeast Asia or this part of the region have an autonomous kind of policy setting. So in that regard, vis-a-vis, not only vis-a-vis China, but also even vis-a-vis United States, I mean, Japan and Southeast Asia has a role to create a kind of a more, autonomous, zone. I mean, it could form into a kind of a set of standards. If you want to operate certain kind of, unmanned, it could be anything, unmanned something, in this region, it has to be this standard, that standard. I think those kind of, rule setting. And that's why the trust matters. If you talk about all the data centers or the testings, it is all about trust. Do you want this company to test this? It's really about the trust. So that's why Japan can leverage this trust in this kind of technological rivalry environment. So in that sense, I'm not, I'm sorry that I don't elaborate what exactly the rules should be and the architecture should be, but I think the logic, I think I will highlight is that part. Yeah.
Well, I'm surprised, Nobu, about your comment about technology. I would have thought Japan is pretty far up there on technology, not only of its own, but because of its access to global technology research and R&D cooperation. But
not that optimistic.
Not optimistic. Well, we shall discuss further at some point. Let us close with the co-editor of the book, John, Professor. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Satu. So one way of answering this question is to say, well, under what conditions might U.S.-China relations get so conflictual or adversarial that Japan simply has to make a choice? And we can imagine scenarios in Taiwan or an escalation in the South China Sea in which Japan would have to make a choice. Now, the choice wouldn't necessarily be all in with one or all in with the other. The choice could be to attempt some form of equidistance or leaning in one direction or the other. But the choice would be informed by a sense of how much did Japan wish to or think that it could balance against constrained China, and how much does it believe that it would need to accommodate a greater Chinese influence and power in the region? And we don't know the answer to that. In part, it would depend on contingencies we can't foresee. But there certainly are plausible scenarios, and scenarios that are arguably more plausible now that we've had the invasion of Ukraine, that could happen in the coming years, that would force Japan to lay out its cards a little bit more explicitly for the world to see on where it falls on the spectrum. But another way that my co-editor Tsutsui and I have thought about throughout this project to look at the question is not just what happens if there's that type of eventuality, but how is Japan, through its current policy, trying to prevent that from happening? And this is where Japan's policy, what we're calling this courteous approach, is so important. Japan is trying not simply to be an American lackey who follows the U.S. in lockstep and balances assertively against China in ways that make the risk of diplomatic or military escalation greater. Japan is trying to have some independence in important ways from the United States as well as China, in part because it believes that a peaceful regional order is more likely to emerge from this sort of multipolar or multilateral framework than through an old 19th century balance of power arrangement. And so the likelihood that Japan will have to make a choice is affected by the policies that it adopts today. It is a key player in this region, and how it plays its cards now will determine whether and when it has to make more decisive moves later.
Well, thank you, John. Those are very thought-provoking and very insightful comments. I can't wait till all three of you produce yet another book, because we will anxiously await, and we have a standing offer if you wish to discuss it on one of the East-West Center programs, and hope we can all see all of you in person before long. For our participants who joined us, thank you. Just will flag 2 events coming up. Later today on Capitol Hill, we're launching the Pacific Islands Matter for America, America Matters for the Pacific Islands report, as well as having a discussion with a number of regional Pacific Island leaders, representatives of US territories, as well as the ambassadors of Australia and New Zealand and American officials from across our government. And then on March 14th, sticking to Southeast Asia, we have a program called The Street and the Ballot Box, a book by Dr. Lynette Ong on the Bersih movement in Malaysia, the elections and implications for Malaysian politics. And we'll also be having a book talk of Dr. Prashant Parmeswaran, who's going to be talking on his new book on US Southeast Asia. So we've got a lot of Southeast Asia work coming up, and those of you on this call may be interested in that, as well as other programs, because we cover the whole region. If you're not signed up for our events, publications, or other activities, fellowships, please do so. And with that, let me once again thank very much our 3 wonderful presenters for discussing the book, staying up late at night in Tokyo, taking part of their day here in Michigan from Ann Arbor, Professor Ciorciari and Watanabe-san. I'm not sure where you are these days, maybe in DC, but we thank you. And Sarah and colleagues, thank you for arranging such a wonderful program. We'll see you soon. Be healthy, be safe, and thank you very much from the East-West Center. Good day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.